We left last week with the 1903 elections, split into what was essentially a three-way tie between the protectionists, the free traders, and Labour. Having previously been able to bank on Labour's votes, the failed passing of the Conciliation and Arbitration Bill divided Alfred Deakin's coalition government. During that same summer, the summer of 1903 to 1904, the English cricket team was touring Australia, and this prompted Deakin to express his frustration. What kind of cricket can be played with 3 11s, he went on record saying. With Parliament in gridlock and 3 voting blocks all pitted against each other, Deakin was about to take one of the biggest gambles in Australian history. He went to Labour's leader, Chris Watson, and said that his protectionists would support Labour in leading a coalition government. Deakin effectively handed over the office of Prime Minister to Labour. Okay, so this chapter of Australian history is a really great one because the flipping hits a new level, but it is important to note that Watson's new Labour-led coalition was the first national Labour government to take place anywhere in the world. However, Deakin was completely playing them. If you missed it last week, Labour refused to pass the Protectionist Conciliation and Arbitration Bill because the Industrial Tribunal didn't cover state government employees like railway workers. After Edmund Barton failed to negotiate an agreement, he resigned to the High Court and his successor, Alfred Deakin, was banking on winning a majority in the 1903 election. And so, having agreed to play second fiddle to Labour, Deakin was hoping to do 2 things. On the one hand, Deakin wanted to show that Labour truly was a minority and that by itself it was powerless to pass legislation. And then secondly, he wanted to show them that governance was a tough responsibility that required compromise. It was very easy to throw shade from the sideline when you don't have to try and directly win the vote of most Australians. Deakin's protectionists gave Labour the same treatment that they gave Barton and blocked any attempt of theirs at passing the Conciliation and Arbitration Bill. In fact, Deakin went as far as calling Labour member and future Prime Minister Billy Hughes an ill-bred urchin who one sees dragged from a tart shop kicking and screaming as he goes. It was probably a mad burn for the early 20th century. But Deakin wasn't done in putting Labour in its place. He did the unthinkable and then aligned with George Reid's Free Traders to form a new government. Just think about that oxymoron for a second. The Free Traders and the Protectionists were in a coalition government. That's like the Australian Progressive Party and Cory Bernardi's Conservative Party being in a coalition. They're by definition opposites. So effectively, Deakin let Labour govern for a few months, and after showing them how tough governing in a minority could be, he pulled the pin and sent his protectionists across the aisle to back George Reid's Free Traders. And in terms of bringing Labour back under its thumb, mission accomplished. Outgoing Prime Minister Watson even said, "We don't want office, we just want to stop the retrogressive movement that Reid is heading." And for Labour, the message was clear. Failure to side with the protectionists would result in a free trader government. So George Reid was Australia's 4th Prime Minister in as many years. Though Deakin was a great orator, he actually had nothing on Reid, with some even labelling the new Prime Minister as the best orator across the empire. He seemed to have something of Churchill's wit too. In reference to his weight, he was once asked by a heckler what he'd call the baby. Reid replied, "If it's a boy, I'll name it after myself. If it's a girl, I'll call her Victoria. But if, as I strongly suspect, it's nothing but wind, I'll name it after you."
Wickedly funny.
I guess history's just whittled it down to the gems.
Now, Reid had 2 historical enemies. The first was actually his predecessor, Sir Henry Parkes, who led the Free Traders before him, and his second was his new coalition ally, Alfred Deakin. You see, Reid had enjoyed a good relationship with Edmund Barton despite their political rivalry, and Reid even bailed out Barton when William Lyon tried to snake him out of being Australia's first Prime Minister. And so even though the protectionists sided with Reid, Deakin refused to serve in Reid's cabinet, and this would be a sign of how hamstrung Reid's Free Traders would be. Within 2 weeks, Watson, who was now with his tail between his legs after Deakin played him, signalled a vote of no confidence in Reid.
You could call for a vote of no confidence in Chancellor Valorum.
I move for a vote of no confidence in Chancellor Valorum's leadership.
However, Reid's government was to make some achievements. Firstly, the Free Traders could actually pass the Conciliation and Arbitration Bill because unlike Labour, they had no interest in protecting state workers, and so actually found common ground with the protectionists. Secondly, Reid actually passed a Seat of Government Act which secured the nation's capital as Dalgety, or the fact that I don't know how to pronounce it's about to prove my point. Reid had long advocated for a capital within New South Wales as the price of having the most senior colony lead the country in Federation, and it was nearly exactly halfway between Sydney and Melbourne. But you might be thinking, wait, Canberra's the capital of Australia. Well, more on that in a later episode, but had later parliaments pursued Reid's plan, Dalgety would have a whole lot more than 205 people living there today. Unfortunately for Reid, though he had a temporary coalition, he was simply outgunned by the protectionists and Labor. But that wouldn't stop him from one last roll of the dice. If Reid could peddle anti-socialist hysteria hard enough, that could create enough dirt to stick on the walls of Labor and the protectionists in an election. So, what if he used his oratory to really go on the attack and slam socialism, and then after that seek a dissolution of Parliament and have new elections?
Hey, this guy's a commie!
Hey, keep it quiet! Where'd a nice little boy like you learn such a bad word like that, huh?
Commie, traitor to our country!
When Parliament resumed in 1905, Watson immediately denounced Reid again, but this time the killing blow came when Deakin withdrew his party support for the Free Traders. Reid pressed for that dissolution he was so after, but it was denied by the Governor-General, and so he stepped down. In his wake, Alfred Deakin would return as the nation's Prime Minister. He'd been patient, calculated, and now back from the dead, he was in a far stronger position with Labor firmly under his control. Or was he? Labor had a new member who had growing influence within the party, and he wasn't about to roll over like John Watson had. His name was Andrew Fisher. Thanks for watching. If you liked the video, don't forget to leave a like and consider subscribing so that you don't miss a single episode in this series. Next week, we're looking at Deakin's second stint in power and the challenges he faced with Labor's new leader, Andrew Fisher. Oh, and Teddy Roosevelt will be popping in too. We can't wait to see you next time for our next venture into a fascinating part of history.